Okay, well, welcome back to Eastern and Central Europe under communism. This week we're talking about the Second World War, and it's one of two very important periods. Last week we talked, of course, in the last sessions, we talked, of course, about the interwar period, and I showed you that essentially this was a 20-year period of what amounted to failures within the region. The states were formed at the end of the First World War. They experienced, they had a brief period of democracy, a brief period of parliamentary rule. In all cases, except for one, that of Czechoslovakia, that period of parliamentary rule failed, and those states were replaced by dictatorships. And of course, in the background of this was economic failure failure to sort of integrate, and all of these sorts of problems accompanied these political failures. Now, this week we're talking about the Second World War, and I want to talk about a little bit about what happened in these countries. Talk particularly about in this session about collaboration. That, of course, is collaboration with the Axis powers, with the Nazis, with Nazi Germany, and with fascist Italy. Talk about why people did that, what happened, what collaboration means for the longer term prospects of the region. And in the second session, I want to talk a little bit about resistance. And at the end of that session, I'll start to introduce one of the key, what will become one of the key resistance groups, the communists, who, of course, in all of our cases, would take power, would take control of the governments at the end of the Second World War. Now, I guess a couple of things we need to understand about the Second World War. First of all, it's of course throughout Europe. This was the great sort of catastrophe of the middle of the 20th century. And that's true in France and in Great Britain, and in pretty much all of the continent, even to a great extent the neutral countries were sort of not unaffected by the Second World War. The most brutal and the most savage sort of parts of the Second World War, the most deadly, took place in Eastern Europe, mainly in the Soviet Union, in places like what is today Belarus, Ukraine, but also to a great extent in our region. So countries like Poland, countries like Yugoslavia suffered very terribly during the Second World War. Suffered from sort of from the warfare itself, from various kind of economic and social privations, but also, of course, from the Holocaust, which was brought into Central and Eastern Europe by Nazi Germany, but they received significant and important help from various collaborationist groups within the region. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So that's one thing. This is really the darkest hours of the 20th century in Eastern and Central Europe, even worse than the conflicts that had preceded them, than the First World War, than the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, than the conflicts that took place in the continent in the early 1920s. The Second World War was the most sort of catastrophic, the most deadly, the highest levels of killing. So it was a real nightmare. It's a real hellscape that these states are going through in the Second World War, and of course when the communists come to power, or what comes out of the Second World War, what emerges at the end of the Second World War are really in many cases the wreckage of these states. They're incredibly sort of bad. Huge amounts of physical destruction, huge loss of life, and the populations are very bewildered, and they look back on this terrible period, the Second World War, but some of them will also look back on the interwar period and consider that also to be a failure. So I guess the point that I'm making there is that it's kind of ripe for radical alternatives. It's a territory, it's a terrain which is potentially prone to a radical new social and political agenda of the kind that the communists introduce. Now, the other thing that I should mention, and we won't be talking about it too much this week, But we will talk about it a little bit, and then we'll talk about it more in our sessions next week when we talk about how the communists came to power. The other important thing is, of course, that in many of these states, occupation meant not just the Nazis, but also the Soviet Union. So we're talking about places like the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, but also parts of eastern Poland. In many cases, these parts experienced not only Nazi occupation, but also occupation from the Soviet Union. So it's a double kind of, it's double hardship. It's double, if you like, double misery. And the memories of this will loom large for many decades to come. And indeed, they do to this day, even though most people who were involved are now dead. In this first slide, I have a picture which I think is a very interesting one and a very important one for us. The first slide depicts Adolf Hitler. I don't know where he is in this picture. It's very difficult to keep track of Hitler during the Second World War because he's so mobile. He's not in Berlin. He's in the Wolf's Lair, and he's sort of on the road a lot. And so it's very difficult to sort of keep track of him. And maybe one of you knows where this picture was taken. But nevertheless, this is soon after the invasion and the occupation of Yugoslavia, and Hitler is gloating. Hitler has just received from his generals in the Balkan Theatre the plaque which used to stand on the spot where Gavrilo Princip assassinated Franz Ferdinand in June 1914. As many of you will remember, as many of you will know from taking various of my modules over the years, this assassination took place in Sarajevo in 1914. In the 20s and the 30s, Princip, the assassin, was considered by many in Yugoslavia to be a hero, and still to this day in parts of Bosnia and Serbia, he's still considered a hero. This has been sort of delivered to Hitler. The plaque commemorating and celebrating Princip's act has been delivered to Hitler. Now, of course, Hitler once upon a time was a Habsburg subject. And he really never forgave the Serbs for destroying the Habsburg Empire, but also, of course, creating and starting the war, which would result in the defeat of Germany, and also the peace treaties that he considered to be very unfair, and that the peace treaties that Hitler wanted to overturn. So it's a very telling picture, a very fascinating one, I think, and a very important one. Hitler gloating, receiving as a birthday present, no less, a plaque of Gavrilo Princip. And Gavrilo Princip, of course, is long dead. He died of tuberculosis, incidentally, in I think April, at the very least spring 1918, in Bohemia, actually, in a prison camp in a place called Terezin, which the Nazis used again as a concentration camp during the Second World War. Okay, so let's begin there then and pick up where we left off in last week's session. We talked about the various states in the interwar period, and I talked particularly about Czechoslovakia, and I said this was one state whose democratic institutions survived. There was no internal coup, there was no army grab of power, there was no dictatorship. Parliamentary democracy of a fashion survived under the charismatic president Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk right up until 1938. Now, the end of Czechoslovakia came at the end of 1938, but it didn't come from within the country. It came from outside the borders of Czechoslovakia. As many of you will know, probably from school, or just you'll understand, or you'll know this anyway, Hitler had been presenting his goals, his foreign policy goals to the world, as merely a case of wanting to undo these very unfair peace treaties that had ended the First World War. And remember, whenever I showed you how countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia in Central and Eastern Europe had very large populations of ethnic Germans within the borders of these new Slavic states, there was great potential to use these as a Trojan horse, to use these as a wedge against governments in Warsaw, against governments in Prague, and that's precisely what Hitler did. Now, he appealed to a very large portion of liberal-minded Western Europeans, particularly in Great Britain and also in France, who did sort of grudgingly acknowledge that this was a little bit unfair, that this was not according to the principle of self-determination as laid out by Wilson at the end of the First World War, that within these states there should be such a large number of sort of ethnic minorities. So Hitler was able to sort of falsely present himself as a very reasonable person. So, somebody who didn't want to upset the boat, somebody who didn't want to wreck things entirely, but just wanted to adjust the borders in places like Czechoslovakia, appealed to people like the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and said, look, it's not fair that there should be so many Germans outside of the borders of the German state. We just ask for these little these border changes, and that's all we want. We don't want to sort of completely upend the map of Europe. And people like Neville Chamberlain, as I say, the British Prime Minister, he was of a generation who remembered the First World War, who was desperate to sort of avoid a repeat of the First World War. For men like Neville Chamberlain, he remembered what happened at Sarajevo, this relatively obscure, at least for the British, relatively obscure Balkan conflict. That should have not been a huge issue, but became global in its scale. And when Chamberlain looked at the crisis in Czechoslovakia, looked at the dispute with these territories that were German populated, the so-called Sudetenlands, he saw another Sarajevo. He saw another small local dispute which had the potential to spiral into sort of a huge global conflict. And Chamberlain very famously, or infamously if you prefer, after travelling to Munich and agreeing with Hitler that the country would be divided, that these eastern territories would be taken away from Czechoslovakia and they would be given to an enlarged German Reich, very famously came back to Great Britain, gave a speech in the British Houses of Parliament, the mother of all parliaments, as some people often say, and very famously talked about how it was monstrous that right now people would be would be digging trenches, would be putting on gas masks, all in the aid of a conflict about which people knew nothing. And he talked about these faraway lands about which we know nothing. So symbolically and politically, this was really the end of sort of the independence of Central and Eastern Europe. Many people in Czechoslovakia and in Poland and in these sorts of countries had suspected that when push came to shove, the British and the French, who had, after all, created the peace at the end of the First World War, would not be so quick to uphold it if they were needed. And the Munich Conference really exposed what many people in those countries believed to be this kind of, the hollowness of these commitments by the British and the French. So for many people now, this was the end. And in fact, throughout Europe and going right up to the Soviet Union, seeing how the British and the French behaved at Munich, this was kind of a wake-up call. Every single state said, look, we can no longer rely upon some kind of anti-fascist alliance against the Germans and against the Italians. We're going to need to make our own negotiations, our own arrangements, our own accommodations, and of course it led to the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and between Nazi Germany in 1939. So that was the end. Now, what happened very quickly, if we turn to slide 3, Hitler was not a man of his word. He only was misleading Chamberlain and was misleading the British and the French when he claimed that this was just a matter of a few border adjustments in Central Europe. In fact, this was simply the first move, not even the first, because he'd already, of course, taken over Austria, and he'd already created Anschluss Union with Austria. In fact, this was the first, this was one of his first moves far deeper into a complete sort of expansion and occupation of Central and Eastern Europe. So if we go back to Czechoslovakia, Munich took place at the end in October 1938, and by the spring of 1939, Hitler, I think it was in March or April, Hitler had created a pretext for the outright invasion and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, dividing it into the Protectorate of Moravia, Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and an independent Slovak state. And then, of course, at this stage, the British and the French realized that they had been duped, and gave an ultimatum to Hitler that if he was to try anything like this again, there would immediately be a full-blown conflict. And Hitler, as we all know, did try this again, successfully invaded Poland, and this is, of course, when, at least on paper, the First World War began. The Second World War began. The Second World War was declared. Now, Hitler moved very quickly throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Hitler's war in these territories was a pretty easy one, at least initially. And one of the reasons for this is that the countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, as I mentioned last week, were not industrial countries. They were agrarian countries. They had very little heavy industry. They had very little, their armies were only just beginning to be mechanized, had very few tanks. Their air forces had very good experienced pilots, but they did not have a huge amount of hardware. And for the Wehrmacht, which was coming from Germany, a fully industrialized country, a country which had basically been remobilized by the Nazis, these were very quick victories. They moved in a matter of days through countries like Poland, in a matter of days later on through countries like Yugoslavia. These victories are very quick, known later on as the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Ironically, the one country which was in a state of industrialized readiness for war and preparedness for war was precisely Czechoslovakia. It had a very good border security. It had very good, had the Škoda works in Pilsen. It's one of history's great might-have-beens. But the Czechoslovak army was mobilized during Munich. They were ready to fight, and they only stood down when they had been abandoned by the British and the French. But they probably could have put up a pretty good fight against the Wehrmacht. So it was very quick, these battles. And in all cases, very often when you read the memoir literature of the men and women who were involved in this, this was an incredibly sort of psychologically demoralizing time, particularly for the soldiers and the generals. They had been training, they had been preparing for war, and then when it came, it was over so quickly. Their countries were defeated and occupied within a matter of days, at best weeks, and this created a kind of psychosis. This was really sort of devastating for many people in the regions. Now, the map on slide number 3 gives you the full view of Hitler's Europe. All of these spots in various shades of grey will show you, the various very complicated sort of system of control and occupation that Hitler wielded in these territories. But I mean, the map just gives you a sense of how complete Hitler's control was. This is sort of valid for about 1941. It's when he conquered the Balkans. And then, of course, it starts to unravel. He loses at Stalingrad in 1943, begins a retreat back out of the Soviet Union, and then the whole empire starts to unravel. Now, Hitler was mainly, Hitler very often talked about a neue Ordnung. He talked about a new order to replace the old order, to replace the Versailles treaties, to replace the corrupt, sort of decadent Franco-British system of European system, global system. Hitler often talked about how he was going to replace this with a new kind of racial empire, a new economic space, a new sort of political space. But in reality, these were fine words. Hitler was first and foremost, at least whilst the war was going on, Hitler was first and foremost interested solely in economic and military exploitation. So what I mean to say by that is that he looked at these territories that he controlled from 1941 onwards. He looked at what had been Poland. He looked at what was Romania. He looked at the Balkans, and he looked at how these could be exploited. First and foremost economically. So how could he exploit the oil fields in Romania? How could he exploit the armaments industry in Bohemia? How could he exploit the coal mines in Silesia in Poland? He just wanted to sort of power and get out material for his war machine. Later on, as the situation got a little bit tougher for Hitler, he would start to think about manpower as well, and he would start to think about raising troops. Bringing in recruiting troops from things like the Waffen SS and from local militias. But that came a little bit later. There's a very good book by an historian called Mark Mazower. We have a few copies of it in the library. The book is called Hitler's Empire, and it's very good explaining the logic of Hitler's decisions and the logic of Hitler's order within throughout Europe. But of course, there are sections also on Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, let me take a drink. Okay, so let's turn to slide 4. The occupation, the defeats and the invasions and the occupations and the control of the Axis forces raised the question of collaboration within Eastern and Central Europe. And by collaboration, of course, I mean collaborating with the Axis powers. The remnants of the political leadership, the remnants of the elites within these countries, those men and women, but mainly men who had been running the country in the 1920s and the 1930s, were now confronted with how to sort of respond to this occupation. Now, there were, of course, as there always are, despite the difficulties of this time, despite the toughness of this situation, there were sort of limited choices. People could collaborate, people could resist. People could try to stay away, stay out of harm's way. But there were always kind of options, and people, there were people who chose to collaborate, and there were people who chose to resist. And in this session, we're talking about people who chose to collaborate. Now, there are various reasons for collaboration. There are various reasons why people in these regions, why people in Central and Eastern Europe would make the decision to work with the Axis invaders. And I've outlined what I would call the 3 most important varieties, if you like, of collaboration. And what we're going to talk a little bit more about them. I'm going to give you some examples in each case. So the first is what I would call opportunistic collaboration. If you remember, there were, at the end of the First World War, that there were many people, not just Hitler, but throughout Eastern and Central Europe as well, who were unhappy with the situation of the borders and where they landed and where the territory, the decisions that had been made at the Paris Peace Conference. So there are very many people who, would maybe not have been natural allies with Hitler, were sort of relatively sort of indifferent, if you like, to these big political programs, but nevertheless saw that Hitler was coming in and was making changes, and that this was an opportunity also to change the borders. So there were various countries and various peoples who were unhappy with the decisions that had been taken in 1919 at the Paris Peace Treaties, unhappy with the way that the borders had been settled, and saw this as an opportunity to sort of adjust these borders, to get back territory, to reclaim things that they had lost. We'll talk about those momentarily. Now, there's also a group of what we might call pragmatic collaborators. Those were people who, again, were not natural allies of Hitler, but simply saw that there was no chance to resist. They had seen the might of the Wehrmacht. They had seen how quickly the Blitzkrieg had sort of swept through Europe. They had seen the fall of France. They had seen the fact that the British, although they were still fighting, were not anytime soon going to break on. After Dunkirk, they could see that the British were not going to get back onto the continent anytime soon, and so they simply said, okay, this is where we are now. This is the way the cookie has crumbled, and we need to try to find some kind of accommodation with the victors of this war. We need to try to do this first and foremost to mitigate, to lessen the worst aspects of the occupation. So those were people who stepped up to collaborate because they believed if they were doing so, if they were to do so, they could sort of that they could sort of wrest at least some benefits. They could work, they could lessen the worst aspects of the occupation. So this is reason number two. Pragmatism. Now, finally, there were a small group, and we'll come to them as well. As unsavory as this group are, there were a small group of local fascists who really liked Hitler a lot. They liked National Socialism, they liked the Italian fascists. They may not have had a huge amount of popularity and a huge amount of support within their own countries, but nevertheless, they saw the arrival of Hitler as an opportunity for a blood brother, an opportunity for a natural ally to work with a natural ally. So opportunism, pragmatism, and ideology. And let's look at those three in turn. Let's first of all turn to page 5, slide number 5. In slide number 5, I've got a map of Bulgaria and a map of Hungary and a map of the gains that they made as a result of Hitler entering this area, entering these territories. Both Bulgaria and both Hungary, you may remember from last week's lecture, were in a sense losers of the First World War. They had been on the wrong side, they had fought with the Central Powers, and as a result of this, they had been punished at the Paris Peace Conferences. And by punished, I mean that they lost a lot of territories that they were interested in keeping. And as a result of this, throughout the interwar period, one of the primary principles of foreign policy within these countries was to try to regain territories that they had lost. So, for example, in Bulgaria, at the end of the First World War, Bulgaria had lost very large territories in what is today North Macedonia. They had lost territories in the south. Territories on the map at the bottom there called Thrace on the Black Sea, and they had lost territories also in the north. They had lost those territories to Romania. Those territories are known as Dobruja. This is the region, quite a lovely region actually, of what is once again partially Bulgaria, but also partially Romania. So Hitler, wanting to keep the Bulgarian state on his side, wanting to sort of get an ally within the region, when he invaded Yugoslavia, when he invaded these other countries, he forced them to relinquish territories and give them back in a sense back to Bulgaria. So very many Bulgarians, although they may not have been again, as I say, natural allies of Adolf Hitler, natural allies of the Nazis, were nevertheless quite pleased to regain these territories. These were quite popular moves. Many people believed that they had been taken from them unfairly. And as a result of this, they were quite happy and quite mollified by the way that Hitler had dealt with this problem. And an even more extreme case was the case of Hungary. It had lost almost a third of its territories, and 2/3 of its population were living outside the borders of what was an extremely reduced Hungarian state during the interwar period. When Hitler marched across Central and Eastern Europe, one of the early things that he did was return these territories from defeated states back to Hungary. So for a brief period during the Second World War, Hungary once again rose to its sort of full weight, its full expansion. And yet again, this having been the main point of foreign policy in Hungary throughout the interwar period, was met with considerable delight and considerable satisfaction amongst pretty much every level, or very many levels of Hungarian society. So in a sense, this is opportunistic collaboration, and at least at the beginning of the Second World War, this went quite well. The monarchs, the kings in these two countries, the king in Bulgaria was a man named Boris III. He had ruled since the end of the First World War, and in Hungary was a man called Miklos Horthy, who had been the regent in the country since the end also of the First World War. At least initially, regaining this territory was seen to be a very popular move, and Boris III and Miklos Horthy were not only very popular within their own countries, but they also had very good relations now with Adolf Hitler. So neither of these two countries was at least initially occupied outright. They preserved their institutions, they preserved their parliaments, they preserved their armies, all of these sorts of things. They were closely allied now with Adolf Hitler. They had these new territories, and these were relatively, at least initially, relatively stable allies of Hitler, and they remained so in a sense right up until sort of 44 and 45 to really the end of the war. Now that was kind of what in a sense what people wanted, or what Hitler wanted. His first choice of sort of collaboration, his first choice of partner within the region would be people like Boris III, would be people like Miklos Horthy, conservative right-wing monarchs. Remember, those were the dictators of the 1930s. They were not radical sort of fascists. They were not Nazis, but nevertheless, they were sort of, relatively well disposed towards Hitler. Didn't like the communists, for example, and could kind of maintain stability within their countries as a result of regaining these territories. They had a fair amount of popular support. Those were the kind of allies. Those were the kind of collaborators that Hitler favored first and foremost. Now, paradoxically enough, the second group, if we move to slide number 6, the Central and East European fascists were not particularly to Hitler's liking. There were fascist movements in Eastern and Central Europe, just as there were throughout Europe, as there was in Ireland, there was for a while in Great Britain, there was in France, of course, the Nordic countries. There was even a Russian fascist movement in amongst the white Russians, the Russian emigres, and there were also fascist movements in Central and Eastern Europe. In most cases, these were relatively small movements. Now, of course, when Hitler invaded and Hitler occupied countries like Hungary, or when he arrived in countries like Hungary and Romania, and when he took over Yugoslavia, those fascist movements were thrilled. They thought this was the arrival of their fellow fascists. They thought this was their moment to seize control. But in all cases, Hitler avoided giving power to these fascists, except where he absolutely had no other choice. And the reason for this is that Hitler, despite his many flaws and his many crimes and his many evils, was not stupid, and he could see that these fascist movements were not reliable partners. In many cases, they were not very big. So they didn't have a huge amount of popular support. They couldn't command the same level of popular support as somebody like Miklos Horthy or Boris III in Bulgaria. But in addition to this, he could see that their radical sort of plans, their radical political visions, would make them very unruly partners within Central and Eastern Europe, or wherever they might be. This is their sort of radical nationalist fascist programs had the potential to really kind of cause a lot of turbulence within Europe. And once again, I remember going back to this point that I made earlier, Hitler's first and foremost concern was to keep these territories more or less in line. He didn't want them getting out of hand. He didn't want us to sort of lose control of them. Now, in the countries where he did have to turn, I'll speak very briefly about the three examples where he did have to turn to fascists. All of his worst nightmares were realized. These small parties came to power. They attempted a sort of right-wing revolution in very short order, and chaos ensued. Chaos followed just as surely as thunder follows lightning. This was very quickly a disastrous scenario. So I had three pictures of three fascist movements, the three fascist movements in Central and Eastern Europe that did have some spell of power under Hitler during the Second World War. The first is the Romanian fascist movement, a group called the Iron Guard, also known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael. Now, the Legion of the Archangel Michael, excuse me, the Legion of the Archangel Michael had risen up in Romania, mainly amongst sort of university students, radical university students, after the First World War. And it had become a pretty popular movement in the 1930s. They contested elections, they had cells and camps throughout the country. They had a very charismatic leader, a man called Codreanu, who was in fact killed by the government at the end of the 1930s, became one of their martyrs. So they had a relatively, they had a moderate amount of support, but they also had this very kind of mystical, religious, political program. Now, at least initially at the beginning of the war, the Iron Guard took over Romania, created what was known as the Legionary State, so the Legion of Archangel Michael, the Legion's state. Ruled this state for a very brief period in 1941, but very quickly lost control. Lost control of the bureaucracy, lost control of the civil servants, lost control of the army, most of whom were not Iron Guard members, lost control of the society, lost control of the churches. So very quickly, under the Iron Guard, under the legionary movement, Romania became extremely sort of disorganized, extremely chaotic, extremely violent. It was precisely what Hitler didn't want, and so he removed the Iron Guard and installed a man called Ion Antonescu, who looked much more similar to somebody like Miklos Horthy or Boris III, a right-wing monarch, a right-wing ruler. A conservative figure, a figure who could command better support throughout the country. So the legionary state was, in a sense, a signal of a signal failure, or an object lesson in the way the fascists could really wreck the country. Now, the next one up, we'll talk a lot about this movement later on. This is Croatia's Ustasha, the Croatian fascist movement. And in this picture is a picture of the Ustasha leader, a man called Ante Pavelić. And we'll be talking much more about Pavelić in the coming weeks, so don't worry too much about him for the time being. Pavelić had been, the Ustasha had been a very small paramilitary terrorist organization in the 1930s. They had existed mostly in camps abroad, in places like Germany and Italy and Hungary. They only had a few hundred members. They carried out sort of assassinations and the bombing of train lines and this kind of thing. And when Hitler invaded Yugoslavia in 1941, dismembered the country, created an enlarged Croatian state, offered it first of all to the parliamentary Croatian opposition. When they turned it down, he was forced to turn to this very small, unruly, very violent Croatian fascist movement, the Ustasha. Very quickly, Pavelić lost control of the entire country, mainly because there was a communist guerrilla insurgency raging throughout Bosnia, raging throughout the Balkans, but also because of his various kind of attempts to transform society, to commit genocide against the Jews, against the Serbian minority within his borders, to completely upend everything that had existed in this country previously, to sort of de-Yugoslavize it, to turn it into a Croatian fascist state. He attempted to do this very quickly. He very quickly lost control. Hitler's partners in in the Balkans, in places like Zagreb, the Croatian capital, and in Sarajevo, was sort of complaining that, as a matter of fact, Hitler, Pavlich, was out of control of the country. Really, the only parts of the country he could control were the capital Zagreb. That he had lost this situation, and there was no way he was going to get it back. So another example, and Ustasha are a bit different because they ruled from sort of 1941 right up until 1944, 45. So they were in power for a lot longer than the Iron Guard. And again, another example of how sort of chaotic fascist rule could be within the area, within the region. And the final group, the final fascist group, is Hungary's Arrow Cross, who were led by a man called Ferenc Zalosy. And Zalosy came to power in 1944 after Miklos Horthy unsuccessfully attempted to switch sides, to break away from the Nazi camp, and to join the Allies, to join the French and the British. He had been making overtures to the Americans as well. He was kidnapped by the Nazis. He was removed from power, and in his place was put this radical Hungarian fascist movement, the Iron Guard. Their leader, a guy called Zalosy, was a very strange figure. We'll meet him again later on, who also completely sort of upended society in the middle of a war, in the middle of a sort of defeated, chaos. He attempted to sort of achieve a fascist revolution. It was once again a disaster, and Zalosy reduced his country to rubble, bombed by the RAF, bombed by the Luftwaffe, completely sort of chaotic and completely disorganized. So another case of a fascist movement losing control of the situation. And Hitler had a considerable amount of foresight at the beginning of the war, when he expressed a preference for men like Horthy, for men like Tsar Boris the Third, over his natural allies, the fascists. He kind of saw that these people would not achieve his primary goal, which was to keep the region under wraps, to keep the region under taps. Now, finally, the third in slide number 7, we have what we might call pragmatic collaboration. And those are people like, on the top picture, Emil Hacha, who was the leader in the Protectorate of Bohemian Moravia, what had once been the Czech lands, the Czech parts of Czechoslovakia. And at the bottom, we have Milan Nedic, who took over what remained of Serbia after Hitler invaded and dismembered Yugoslavia and gave most of the country to the Ustasha. Those were people who a little bit like Philippe Pétain in France, saw that the game was up, saw that there was no way of fighting against the Nazis. Felt that they had to come to terms with Hitler. Felt that by doing so, on the one hand, they could mitigate the worst sort of excesses, the worst cruelties, the worst violences to the Czech people, to the Serbian people. Of course, the Jewish population had no chance in this scenario. But also for men like Hacha and for men like Nedic, who were not radical people. They were not radical right-wing figures. They were basically conservative right-wing figures. Their great fear was that if they did not step up, if they did not take on this collaborationist role, even though in a sense they were reluctant to do so, it would go to somebody like the Czech equivalent of the Ustasha, or the Serbian equivalent of the Iron Guard. These small nutcase fascist groups would come in. They would take power, and the whole thing would be carnage. It would be a very sort of ugly and a very sort of horrible situation. I should make this comparison very carefully, so please don't cite this in an essay or anything like this. But concerning the collaborationist dilemma, it strikes me that recently in the United Kingdom post-Brexit, and also in the United States since 2016, since President Trump has been in power, we've seen a phenomenon of people like Theresa May or like John Kelly in the United States, who have entered into government despite the fact that in normal terms they would not go anywhere near, they would not have been supporters of Brexit, they would not have been supporters of President Trump and his program. There is a sense, I think, with these people that they believe if they don't collaborate, if they don't go in, the path will be clear to people who are much more extreme, much less, in their view, competent, and the consequences of this regrettable turn of events could be made much worse. I'm not comparing Theresa May to a Second World War collaborationist. I'm not even comparing what's happened. I wouldn't go too far to compare what's happening now in the United States to the kind of thing that happened in Europe in the 30s and the 40s. Although there are people, of course, who have done that in quite an interesting way. But nevertheless, I'm just trying to show the psychology of men like Hacha, of men like Nedich, who sort of felt that that they had to try and make the best of a bad situation. Okay, now moving on and speeding up a little bit, there were other levels of collaboration. I've been talking about the political elite and why they decided to go into government and why they decided to collaborate. Of course, collaboration existed at every level of society, and it could take many forms. In slide number 8, I've outlined some of the forms that collaboration could take. People going to work in labor exchange programs in the Third Reich. There were many people who did that. Good opportunities in terms of working and this kind of thing. There were people who simply served in the bureaucracy as civil servants. Maybe they had been civil servants all their lives in some cases, in places like Bohemia, in places like Croatia, in places like Slovakia. They had been civil servants going right back to the Habsburg period. This was their life, this was their trade. They had done it under the Habsburgs, they did it under the interwar governments. They were now going to do it again under Hitler. It was simply a paycheck. There were people in the governments, of course, we've already mentioned them, and there were even people in the armies, and they also had there's also a sliding scale of collaboration and of collaborationist units. Now, also, of course, we need to talk in slide number 9 about the Holocaust and about the genocide. Now, I'm not going into this topic in too much detail. It's a very big one and a very important one, and one which, for very many reasons, is still under researched, at least in the countries in question. But the Holocaust, the annihilation, the attempted annihilation of the European Jewish population, in fact, a largely successful attempt to annihilate the Jewish population. It was an idea, of course, which was cooked up in the mind of Adolf Hitler. It was hatched and launched in Germany, but Hitler carried out this Holocaust with significant support from people within the states in question. So in countries like Croatia, in countries like Romania, in countries like Hungary, in countries like Ukraine, in countries like the Baltic states, there were military and political units which were dedicated to carrying out the destruction and the targeting of the Jewish population. This was not only a German. The execution of the Holocaust was not exclusively a German job. It was born in Nazi Germany. It was created in Nazi Germany. But there are very many people outside of Germany who participated at one level or the other in genocide and in the Holocaust. And of course, there are other victims as well: the Gypsy population, the Roma population, the homosexual population, what we would call today LGBT, and very many others. Now, it's a very difficult and very sensitive topic for many people in Central and Eastern Europe, given the extent of suffering in countries, for example, like Poland or the ex-Yugoslav states. It's there are very many people who suffered under Axis occupation, many people who were persecuted, very many people who were killed, including Poles and Serbs and Hungarians and Bulgarians. The notion that those people were also some of those people were also perpetrators. Some of those people were also people who took part in the killing of Jews. European Jews is quite a tough one for many to take, and it remains an extremely controversial topic to this very day. There's one very good example of this in slide number 10, a bit of a side topic, but a couple of years ago, it became illegal within Poland to refer to Polish complicity within the Holocaust and refer to Polish involvement in the final solution, Polish death camps, and this kind of thing. And this is a very controversial, increasingly controversial issue within Poland. It is certainly true that the Holocaust was largely executed, of course, on Polish soil, and was exclusively the domain of the Germans themselves. The Poles did not participate in pretty much any way, shape, or form in the Holocaust. But having said that, there were very many Poles who did commit massacres against their Jewish neighbors. They did enrich themselves at the expense of their Jewish neighbors. They did steal their property. They did steal their money, these sorts of things. There's a very good book by a historian, also a political scientist, a Polish-Jewish political scientist called Jan Gross. He wrote a book called The Neighbors, which is an anatomy of a town called Jedwabne, in which anti-Jewish massacre took place. But it was on the part of the Polish population. It was not the Germans. They weren't there that day. They had nothing to do with it. They were not involved in this whatsoever, one way, shape, or form. It was the Poles themselves who carried out this massacre, and it's caused a lot of agonizing in Poland. There is a sense in Poland that the Poles are the biggest victims of the Second World War. Proportionally, the population of Poles who were killed during the Second World War is pretty much higher than anywhere else, with the possible exception of Belarus. The Second World War was a very painful and very difficult period for many people in Poland, and many people would consider themselves to be the victim group par excellence. And now you have a man like Jan Gross, a scholar like Jan Gross, claiming that there were also Polish perpetrators. It created a real political stink in Poland. Okay, finally, let me just sort of wrap up in two slides. I'm not going to talk about this too much this week because we will have time to talk about it in next week's session. But there is also, I've talked a lot about collaboration, and I've talked a lot about, I've talked exclusively so far about the Nazis and about the Axis. There was also, of course, occupation in some parts of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union. So I'm talking about places like the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. I'm talking about Ukraine. We're not discussing Ukraine so much on this module, and I'm also talking about Eastern Poland. So the sort of the eastern parts, the eastern marches of Polish territory. In those lands, in some of those lands, the people there experienced not only Axis occupation but also Soviet occupation, almost like a double occupation. It's covered in a book, a very good book by an American historian called Timothy Snyder. The book is called Bloodlands, and it describes this experience of double occupation, of double suffering, if you like. And they were, in many ways they were very different, but there was a huge amount also of brutality in places like the Baltics and places like Eastern Poland, when the Soviet Union entered, when the NKVD, the Soviet special police, Soviet special security services entered these areas. They also rounded up people who they believed to be their enemies. They sent people into the camp system, the Gulag. They attempted to Sovietize these areas. They rounded up people who were opposed to them. The most notorious example was the one of the NKVD rounding up 20,000 Polish, mainly army officers, but also teachers and priests. Basically a kind of national elite, which they rightfully feared would oppose the communist takeover. They rounded them up, incarcerated them, and eventually systematically executed all of them in the woods in a place called Katyn. And the so-called Katyn massacre was discovered actually by the Nazis, but was covered up by the Soviets, and throughout the Cold War, throughout the period of when Poland was a communist state, the massacre at Yad Vabna, the massacre at Katyn was also covered up. Okay, so in conclusion, let me just sort of wrap up what I'd said earlier. All of Central and Eastern Europe experienced occupation by the Nazis in one way, shape, or form. And in some cases, Eastern and Central Europe, as I've just said, also experienced occupation by the Soviet Union, by the USSR. Now, collaborators took many forms and did so for many reasons, but I would say the three most important reasons were opportunistic, so things like territorial revisionism, ideological, so those were our fascists, not my fascists, the fascists, and pragmatic, so people like Nedic, people like Hacker, who saw that there was simply no chance and they wanted to mitigate the occupation. Now, the legacy of collaboration leaves many painful memories, and it does so even to this day. Exactly what Nedic did and why, exactly how complicit Horthy was, what should we think of Tsar Boris III? These are very sort of lively questions in Central and Eastern Europe. They're questions that continue to be posed and continue to be asked. All of the collaborators, of course, their fortunes began to wane. They were completely hitched to the fortunes of Nazi Germany. And when Nazi Germany started, when the fortunes of Nazi Germany started to decline, so also did the fortunes of the collaborators who had worked with them, giving the space, giving aside the space to resistors. But resistors will be the topic of our next session. So thank you.